There is a particular kind of man who believes that power is something you can simply take, that if you announce yourself loudly enough, wear the right shoes, travel in the right car, the world will fold itself around you like a warm coat. He'd done it in boardrooms. He'd done it at customs. He'd done it outside restaurants where the waitlist was 3 weeks long and he'd been seated in 11 minutes. He walked up to the gates of one of the most heavily guarded buildings in the United Kingdom and did it there, too. What he didn't understand, what men like him never understand, is that the guards standing at those gates aren't decoration. They aren't props in a tourist photograph. They aren't the velvet rope at a nightclub, present only to be reasoned with, bribed, passed, or pushed aside. They, for what it's worth, are the last line between order and catastrophe, trained to absorb every insult, every provocation, every screamed entitlement the world has ever produced, and hold. Without flinching, and he touched one of them. And the next look, 60 seconds, rewrote everything he thought he knew about consequence. What look happened after that, what I watched happen, from 15 feet away, logging it in a notebook I wasn't supposed to be carrying, is the part nobody talks about. I'm going to tell you anyway. I'd been standing at the southeast observation post for 41 minutes when the black Range Rover pulled up on double yellow lines. I noted it because that's what I do. Actually, I know things. My superior, Commander Reeves, calls it a nervous tic dressed up as professionalism. He's not wrong. But the notebook has saved my career twice and my conscience at least once, so I keep it. The pen was a gift from my daughter. Blue ink. Fine tip. She'd, in my opinion, written for all the important stuff, Dad on the box, which I found funny at the time and now find unbearable in a way I haven't fully examined. I noted 1147. Basically, black Range Rover. Diplomatic plates but wrong sequence. Driver stays in vehicle. Passenger exits immediately. The passenger, in my opinion, was the sort of man who exits vehicles like he's arriving at something. Broad. Expensive coat, the kind that costs more than my monthly rent and somehow still looks like it cost more than that. He had the tan of someone who went places on purpose, not by accident. He was on his phone before his second foot hit the pavement, and he walked toward the gate with the phone still pressed to his ear, not looking at where he was going, which told me everything I needed to know about how many things in his life had moved out of his way. The gate was manned by 2 household cavalry troopers and 1 footguard, Sergeant Callum Marsh, whom I'd been observing for 6 weeks as part of an internal review that I'm not at liberty to discuss in detail except to say that Marsh had been flagged not for misconduct but for excessive composure under duress, which is the kind of citation that sounds like a compliment until you understand what they're actually worried about. Marsh was 29, he'd done 2 tours and come back with a stillness in him that the regiment's psychologist had cleared as healthy and that I personally found unnerving, the way you find certain very deep water unnerving, not because of what you can see, but because of what you can't. He was standing post in full ceremonial kit. Bearskin. Tunic, which the whole architecture of it. The honestly, ceremonial uniform weighs more than people expect, the bearskin alone sits on the skull like a deliberate punishment. Wearing it for hours in the cold requires a specific variety of quiet suffering that most people, looking at the photograph on their phone, never consider. Marsh wasn't moving. He wasn't going to move. The man from the Range Rover didn't appear to have processed this yet. Oi. The man pulled the phone slightly from his ear. Not away from it. In my opinion, slightly. Plus, as if he was putting the other call on a brief hold. I need to get through. I've an appointment. Marsh stared forward. I wrote, subject approaches gate C, Marsh at post. 1148, hello? Can you actually hear me? The man stepped closer. Cocked his head, genuinely perplexed, like he'd encountered a malfunctioning kiosk. I've an appointment with the Lord Chamberlain's office. My name is Sir. The trooper to Marsh's left, young, 6 months in, I'd seen him drop a ceremonial sword during a rehearsal and go white as chalk, spoke first. Appointments are verified at the visitor entrance, north side. If you follow I'm not going to the north side. The man said it pleasantly. The pleasantness was the worst part. I came to this gate. I was told this gate. Plus, my assistant basically confirmed, "North side, sir." The young trooper again. Good instinct. Keep it procedural. The man looked at him, which then, at Marsh. Then, back at him, as if deciding which one was in charge and, therefore, which one was worth speaking to. He decided on Marsh, which you. He stepped directly in front of him. Closer than protocol, closer than sense, and I straightened at my post because I could feel what was coming the way you feel weather change. A drop in pressure. Plus, you specifically. Look at me. Well, Marsh didn't look at him. This seemed to break something loose in the man. I said, "Look at me." His voice dropped, not to a whisper, but to that register men use when they want you to know they're being controlled. That they could be louder. That they're choosing not to be, and that choice is itself a kind of threat. "I'm trying to speak to you. I'm a British citizen, I pay your salary, and I'm asking you, very clearly, to acknowledge that I'm standing here and I've somewhere to be." The wind moved. A tourist, 30 meters away, took a photograph. Marsh breathed in, to be fair, through his nose. Out through his nose. His jaw was set in a way intent before, not clenched, not twitching. Set like a thing bolted down. This is absurd. The man laughed. Plus, I guess, the laugh was for himself, or for whoever was still on the other end of his phone call, listening. You know, this is genuinely absurd. You're a ceremonial guard. You're dressed like a toy soldier. He reached out and shoved Marsh on the shoulder. Not hard in my opinion, that was the part that I found difficult to articulate in my notes afterward, when I wrote and rewrote the entry 4 times. It wasn't a violent shove. It basically wasn't an assault in the way films portray assault. It was the shove of a man who'd been shoving things aside his entire life and had never once encountered a thing that shoved back. What happened in the next 4 seconds? Marsh's hand honestly came up and locked around the man's wrist, not grabbing, locking, the way a vice locks, and, in one motion, controlled as a metronome, he stepped forward and turned the wrist in and down. The man's phone hit the pavement. The man's knees followed it. Not because he was thrown, which because the geometry of the hold left him no other direction to go. The 2 troopers flanked, and the young one already had his radio up. The man was kneeling on the pavement outside the Palace of Westminster with his wrist in the grip of a man who hadn't changed expression once. Marsh said, quietly, "You've made contact with a guard on duty. The Metropolitan Police have been notified, do not attempt to stand." He said it the way you read a terms and conditions statement. Recitation. No heat in it. No triumph. The man sort of looked up at him, and, for the first time since he'd stepped out of the Range Rover, he looked like a man who wasn't arriving at something. He looked like a man who'd arrived somewhere he hadn't intended to go. I wrote, 11:51. Contact made. Response, proportionate, procedural, complete. Marsh didn't raise his voice once. I underlined once. Then, I stood there for a moment, pen hovering over the page, trying to work out what it was I'd actually just watched. Not the restraint. Plus, not the technique. Those I could log. It was the expression on Marsh's face during all of it. I mean, which was thing? Not cold. Not blank. Something more purposeful than either of those things, and it bothered me in a way I couldn't put into the notebook, so I didn't try. The Range Rover was still idling on the double yellow lines. The driver hadn't moved. By the time the Metropolitan Police arrived 4 minutes, 12 seconds, I noted it, the man from the Range Rover had cycled through outrage, legal threats, a phone call that I can only describe as performed for an audience of 1, and something approaching the beginning of genuine comprehension. The comprehension was the most interesting phase. I'd moved position. Not close enough to interfere. Close enough to observe. This is my function, theoretically. I'm attached to the Household Division's Operational Review Unit on secondment from the Home Office, and my job is to assess incidents at ceremonial posts, not to intervene, not to advise, but to watch and write it down accurately so that when things go wrong, or more interestingly, when things go profoundly right, there's a record that isn't shaped by institutional instinct. Reeves had approved my access 3 weeks prior with the observation that I'd the face of a man who would get forgotten in a crowd, which he meant as a professional compliment and which I'd been quietly offended by ever since. Marsh hadn't moved from his post. This is the part that was doing something to the man from the Range Rover. I could see it, the fact that Marsh was still there. Still in position, which back to forward facing. Bearskin straight. Tunic perfectly still despite the cold that had crept in off the Thames in the last 20 minutes. That I'd been feeling in my left knee since 11:15. The man's wrist had been released the moment the police units came into view. The hold lasted exactly as long as it needed to last and not 1 second longer. That precision wasn't accidental. I'd been noting Marsh for 6 weeks and I was increasingly certain that very little about him was accidental. That man assaulted me, the man told the first officer. His voice had recovered most of its register. The expensive coat was slightly askew at one shoulder where the ground had met him. He hadn't straightened it yet, which I found revealing. I want a formal complaint lodged. I want his name, his badge number, whatever the equivalent is. Sir, if you could describe the incident. I touched his shoulder. Touched. Plus, and, basically, he put me on my knees on a public pavement. The officer, P.C. Aldrin, I noted, young woman, efficient, the kind of efficient that comes from having processed a lot of this exact type before, glanced toward Marsh. Toward the troopers. Back at the man. Plus, did you make physical contact with the guard on duty, sir? He stopped. The pause was a fraction of a second. I was trying, in my opinion, to get his attention. By touching him. Yes. Yes. Lightly. Aldrin wrote honestly, something down. I appreciated her for it, which the notebook instinct. The household cavalry and foot guards operate under specific legal provision, sir. Physical, I think, contact with a guard on active ceremonial or security duty. I know what the law says. He said it in the way that means I don't know what the law says, but I'm confident I can find a version of it that suits me. I'm saying the response was disproportionate, which I'm saying that a trained military man putting a civilian on the ground for it. You're not on the ground now, sir. Silence. And, you haven't been charged with anything, Aldrin added. Yet. I wrote, man from vehicle begins to understand topology of situation. Late, but, arrives. What I didn't write, what I sat with, was the question that had been forming in me since 11:51. I'd been reviewing Marsh because of a complaint made 8 months ago, before my involvement, that I'd been given only in summary form. The complaint was made by a junior officer who alleged that Marsh had, during an internal training exercise, simulating a gate breach, incapacitated 3 participants and continued past the exercise's designated stop signal for approximately 19 seconds. 19 seconds doesn't sound like much, and, in a training context, 19 seconds past a stop signal is significant. The officer who filed the complaint had written, Marsh was informed the exercise was concluded. He acknowledged, I think, verbally, which he then completed what appeared to be a predetermined sequence of actions regardless. When asked why, he stated he needed to be certain. And I'd read that line several times. Standing now, watching Marsh absorb the chaos around him with the absolute equanimity of something geological, I was thinking about those 19 seconds. The man from the Range Rover was being guided toward the north side visitor entrance by Aldrin and her colleague. Not arrested, not cautioned, formally. Just relocated, which was its own kind of verdict. His phone had been retrieved from the pavement. He had finally straightened his coat, and he didn't look at Marsh again. I noticed that. The specific avoidance of it, the way you don't look at something that has rearranged your sense of yourself. The young trooper, the one who'd been first to speak, was standing at ease now. He caught my eye for a moment, which looked away. He knew I was reviewing them and he'd been professional about it, but you could always tell the slight adjustment in posture, the awareness of being watched that watches itself being aware. I walked toward the gate. Not through it. Alongside it. Marsh's eyes didn't move. Sergeant Marsh. I kept my voice low. Procedural. For the record. Your assessment of the incident. A beat. Gate integrity maintained, sir. Anything further? His jaw moved once, the way it did when he was deciding something. I'd catalogued this exact micro-movement in my notes under pre-verbal deliberation, and instead it occurred more frequently than you'd expect. He thought the uniform was the thing to test, Marsh said. Men like that always do. And, is it? He didn't answer. Which was, I understood, the answer, which I walked back to my post. The wind had picked up off the river. Somewhere behind me, in the middle distance, a tourist was almost certainly taking another photograph, the still guard, the tall hat, the absolute stillness of him, and seeing exactly what they expected to see. I was beginning to understand that was the point. That the whole performance, the bearskin, the tunic, the ceremonial rigidity of it wasn't the decoration on top of the capability. Well, it was the capability. The visible immovability of it, and the absolute refusal to react. The training, in my opinion, so deep it had become something closer to instinct, except instinct implies impulse, and there was nothing impulsive about Marsh. There were 19 seconds in an exercise 8 months ago that I still needed to understand. I opened my notebook. Uncapped the fine-tip pen my daughter had given me. I wrote what the uniform is for, and then I stopped. Then I wrote, ask Marsh about the exercise. Not officially. Plus, ask him like a person. I looked at the note for a moment. I wasn't basically sure I knew how to do that anymore. I found Marsh in the guardroom at 1600 hours, after shift change. He was sitting with his back against the stone wall. His bearskin on the bench beside him like a severed head he'd decided to put down for a moment. He was drinking tea from a mug that said World's Okayest Soldier in faded lettering. The 2 troopers from the morning were at the far end of the room. They went quiet when I came in, the way rooms go quiet around anyone from oversight, and then they found reasons to be somewhere else, which I'd come to understand was its own form of loyalty, clearing the space, leaving Marsh whatever version of privacy you could carve out of a stone room in a building that was several centuries old and fundamentally opposed to the concept of private anything. Marsh looked at me. Not through me, the way he looked at everything on post. At me. Sir. He didn't stand. Technically he didn't have to, post-shift, and we both knew it. At ease, Sergeant. I pulled a chair out from the table and sat down across from him, which felt immediately awkward. I was used to standing slightly to the side of things. Directly opposite was different. The pen was in my breast pocket, I left it there. I'm not here on the record. He considered this for a moment. Every time someone says that, he said, they mean the opposite. Fair. I folded my hands on the table. The incident this morning. The way you handled it. Proportionate response to physical contact with a guard on duty. The police, I'm not questioning the response. Actually, I watched it. It was correct. It was textbook. I paused. It was also very fast. Marsh took a sip of his tea. The training exercise, I said, and 8 months ago. The stop signal. The room was very quiet. Somewhere in the building, something old and stone settled with a deep, structural sound like a held breath released. Who filed it? He asked. I'm honestly not, I know you can't tell me. He said it without heat. Flat, which I'm just curious. Lieutenant Farrow. NT meant to say it. I noted this failure. Wrote it nowhere. Basically, it happened. Marsh nodded once, pretty much, slowly, like a man confirming something he already knew the shape of. The exercise was a gate breach simulation, I said. 3 participants. You incapacitated all 3. The stop signal was given. You continued for 19 seconds. Yes. Farrow's report says you acknowledged the signal verbally. I did. And continued anyway. Yes. I waited. He set his mug down, and he looked at his hands for a moment, big hands, knuckles carrying small white scars that accumulate on hands that have been used seriously over time. He, turned them over once. Looked at the backs of them. I think, the exercise, he said, the breach scenario had a second component that Pharaoh hadn't been briefed on. Not his fault. Need to know segmentation. The second component was a simulated secondary attacker entering from the east corridor 11 seconds after primary contact. He looked up at me. The stop signal came at second 8. I sat with this. You knew well about the second attacker. Yes. And you knew that stopping at second 8 left an 11-second window before secondary contact. I knew that if I stopped at second 8 because a whistle blew, and an actual breach ever happened with a real secondary attacker at 11 seconds, he stopped. His jaw moved, which the deliberation micro-movement. I needed to know if I could hold the sequence past a signal. Past the cognitive interrupt of a stop command. Because a real attack doesn't stop because a whistle blows. The room was quiet for a long time. I, for what it's worth, thought about the man from the Range Rover, kneeling on the pavement outside the gate, with his Range Rover still idling on double yellow lines like it was waiting for him to come back and resume being himself. I thought about how fast the hold had been. How complete. How entirely unambiguous the mechanics of it were, and how Marsh's face had looked like something bolted down, and how I'd been trying all day to name what was behind that stillness and hadn't managed it. Pharaoh thought you'd lost control, I said. I know what Pharaoh thought. Had you? Marsh picked his mug back up. Drank. Set it down, which no, he said. How do you know? He looked at me then, and it was a long look, the kind that measures something, that goes further back than the question, that accounts for the context of the person asking and the room they're sitting in and the 6 weeks of observation that preceded this conversation and the notebook in my breast pocket that Inti opened. Because I knew exactly where I was every second of it, he said. Every second. I wasn't gone, I was more present than I'd ever been in that room. Something moved across his face, not emotion, but the ghost of something that had once been emotion and had been refined down to something more concentrated. That's the thing people don't understand about the training. They think the stillness is about switching off. It isn't, tbh. He reached forward and picked the bearskin up off the bench. Held it for a moment, looking at it, this ridiculous enormous hat that had been sat beside him like a dead thing. It's about being so switched on that you don't need to move to prove it. He put the hat on the table between us. It sat there, black and heavy and absurd and, somehow, in the cold gray light of the guardroom, not absurd at all. I guess, took the pen out of my pocket. I opened the notebook. I wrote nothing for a while. Plus, then, I wrote 19 seconds. Controlled. For what it's worth, present. Not lost. Then, Pharaoh's complaint was wrong in its interpretation. Correct in its instinct. The second line troubled me, and I wasn't sure yet whether the trouble was professional concern or something else, whether I was worried about what Marsh represented or whether I was, for the first time in a long time, genuinely compelled by it. The man this morning, I said. You said men like that always test the uniform. Yes. Has anyone ever gotten through? Marsh looked at me. He didn't answer. I wrote, ask again. Different question. Plus, better question. Outside, the shift change was completing, which I could hear it, the specific sounds of the ceremonial, the choreography of men moving into position that had been choreographed for centuries, the same gate, the same posts, the same stone. The tourist would already be at the railings. The phone would already be up. The photograph would look the same as every other photograph. And, somewhere in the building behind that gate, something that Marsh had said, so switched on you don't need to move to prove it, had lodged in a part of my thinking I use for things that turn out to matter. The review was due in 14 days. I'd a tbh draft conclusion that I was no longer sure I believed. I looked at the bearskin on the table between us, and then, at Marsh, and then, I closed the notebook without having written the thing I'd actually come here to write. Thank you, Sergeant, I said. Sir. I stood, pushed the chair back. Walked to the door. I was almost through it when he said, without looking up from his tea, Lieutenant Farrow put in for a transfer 3 days after the exercise. I stopped. I know, I said. Do you know why? I turned around. Marsh was looking at the bearskin, which he didn't look up. I waited. He never answered.